I was driving home from school a few weeks ago when I drove by not one but two billboards that said, "Where are you going? Heaven or hell?" And I thought I was just going to a different place that starts with the letter H, home. In all seriousness, though, it is very human and reasonable for us to wonder about what happens in the afterlife, which might be more aptly called the after death. People across time and space have sought answers to this great mystery. This week's Torah portion is actually called After Death, Achrei Mot. But this chapter of Leviticus is not concerned with what happens to the dead after they die, but rather our Torah draws our attention to what happens to the living when others die. As the first verse of the portion reads, Adonai spoke to Moses Achrei Mot after the death of the two sons of Aaron who died when they drew close to the presence of God. This verse in chapter 16 of Leviticus refers back to the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, which was relayed in chapter 10. The sons had taken Eish Zarah, or strange fire, and without being commanded, had approached the holy altar and were swallowed up by God's fire. Now, 6 whole chapters later, we read this verse, Adonai spoke to Moses, Achrei Mot, after the death of the two sons of Aaron. These words have puzzled commentators throughout the ages, and one of the things that especially jumped out to me is why this gap from chapter 10 to 16. Why would the text explicitly note that God spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's sons so many chapters later? Perhaps the text, like many of us in the immediate aftermath of loss, could not find the words. In fact, we read in Leviticus 10:3, right after his sons died, Vayidom Aharon, Aaron was silent. Both Aaron and the Torah narrator experienced a break in their ability to speak. Now, at a new chapter, the conversation has shifted. We see here an illustration of the fact that life goes on even as death remains a present reality. The death of Aaron's sons is not a one-and-done deal, but something that Aaron comes back to and must learn to live with for the rest of his life. When we experience loss, one of our lifelong tasks is to find ways to remember our loved ones and at the same time learn how to live in a new reality without them. Many of us have experienced at least one life event that has significantly shaped the trajectory of the rest of our lives, and sometimes even future generations. Like a game of pinball, we keep going in a straight line until a bumper sends us in a new direction. But unlike a game of pinball, the bumpers we face and the impact they have on us are often unexpected and unforeseen. As Bruce Feiler notes in his book, Life is in the Transitions, quote, primed to expect that our lives will follow a predictable path, we're thrown when they don't. We have linear expectations, but non-linear realities. And even when we know an external change is coming, we do not always attend to the internal changes that will happen. I am reminded of a woman who, reflecting on the loss of her mother, noted, I had thought about what it would mean for my mother to die, but I had never thought about what it would mean for me to become motherless. Significant loss is one of those disorienting and reorienting experiences which tilts our lives in new directions. Yet even when we are faced with the profoundness of life and death, we still have to carry on with the mundaneness of living. Mary Howe illustrates this beautifully in an excerpt of her poem, What the Living Do. She writes, Johnny, the kitchen sink has been clogged for days. Some utensil probably fell down there, and the draino won't work but smells dangerous, and the crusty dishes have piled up. I've been thinking, this is what the living do. This is what the living do. Stay busy, do the dishes, make the bed, answer the emails, cycle through the everyday. Even when loss hits us with its profoundness, when it feels like time has stopped, life keeps on going like the ticking of a clock. So even after the death of his sons, Aaron is still responsible for carrying out his priestly duties. Moses, as God's spokesperson, continues to relay instructions to his brother. Dash the blood, don't drink and sacrifice, offer the proper fire. In the wake of significant loss or some other big moment, we often jump into action. We respond. We have a toolbox of rituals, kind words, and helpful hands. We might give ourselves permission to feel. Yet perhaps the more difficult and complex challenge is navigating our lives after the dust has settled. How do we carry on? As my mother's yahrzeit approaches next week, I am drawn to the Jewish idea of making their memory a blessing, zichronam livracha. I want to offer two frameworks for making the memories of our loved ones a blessing. One, pausing from the everyday to remember them, and two, infusing their memory into the everyday. Sometimes we remember our loved ones by setting aside special moments to acknowledge them and our feelings. We might write them a letter, visit their grave, attend a Yizkor memorial service. In these ways, we take time aside from our regular affairs to give special attention to loss. I like to think of these moments as pauses. During a pastoral care internship last summer, I learned that when someone dies in the hospital, chaplains will often facilitate something they call the pause with medical staff. This pause is a moment of silence, a moment to acknowledge the human being who has died, and a moment to recognize that the medical team did everything in their power to save that person. As busy as the doctors and nurses are, it is important for them to take this moment, this pause, before running to their next patients. This pause in the hospital occurs at the moment of death, but the same framework can provide meaning and catharsis even years after loss. We can also remember loved ones by integrating them into our everyday lives. One of the ways we do this in my family is by cooking recipes my mom, and even her mom, who died before I was born, used to make. For example, every Passover, we pull out Grandma Susan's plastic box of faded, handwritten recipe cards. Like my mom used to do, we mix the chopped nuts, butter, eggs, matzah cake meal, salt, sugar, and orange juice in a bowl, roll out the dough, refrigerate it, and then slice and bake these really addictive cookies. I can't imagine Passover without them, and I especially this year enjoyed feeding several of them to my 2-year-old niece. Baking this multi-generational recipe is a way to include my mom and her mom in our family and our lives, even though they are no longer with us. Baked into the cookies, their memories continue to be a blessing. We can remember our loved ones, both by pausing and by integrating them into our lives. In these ways, we remember them by continuing to live. As Mary Howe writes at the end of her poem, there are moments walking when I'm gripped by a cherishing so deep for my own blowing hair, chapped face, and unbuttoned coat that I'm speechless. I am living. I remember you. I think back to that billboard. Where are you going? Heaven, hell, home? I'm not so interested in determining what happens to us after we die. I'm much more concerned with learning how to live after others die. And I hope that we may make their memories a blessing in the pauses and in integrating them in our lives. And may we say, we are living, we remember you. Amen.